Well, yeah, by the, say, 1972, I started to work at Memorial University teaching for the first, and I guess I'm not that talented a teacher, so that was a very, very busy period for me because I was doing 3 or 4 other research projects. As I got settled into Memorial, I made contact with people doing research with the Micmac. I discovered that indigenous Aboriginal people in the province of Newfoundland were very badly managed at the time. When they joined Confederation in '49, no accommodation had been made. The federal government did not exercise its constitutional obligations and administer, and it only provided very meager funds for the province to do an administration. The Micmac were the most sophisticated, probably, particularly those at Conn River. So I was immediately the supervisor of a master's student who was spending a lot of time in the community. He never finished his anthropology degree. He married a local woman and became very politically active with that group getting its finally getting recognition under the Indian Act, and the Conn River declared an Indian reserve. That was to happen much later for other indigenous people in Labrador, but still, I got quite active in that. I went to Labrador and got involved with at that time, at this time, in '72, the federal government started funding Aboriginal organizations. Under the white paper, the '69, it had basically tried to end its relationship with Aboriginal people, the federal government, that is. By '72, it had switched around. It was going to settle land claims in areas not yet signing treaties, hadn't signed treaties, and it was going to fund Aboriginal organizations, political organizations. So you got them popping up all over the place, and there was one in Labrador that I started to work with. He called at that time the Naskapis-Montagnais-Innu Association, now called the Innu Nation. I worked, as I say, I was working in the summer on these archaeology projects. I started working on the land claim for the Innu in Labrador. But in '75, Marguerite, my wife, was teaching Crees school teachers. She was interested in the whole issue of maintaining the Cree language in the schools. And under the James Bay, well, it was '75 before the agreement was signed. But anyway, they were trying to have Aboriginal, because the kids went to school speaking virtually no English. And so the white teachers needed help in communicating to the students. So Marguerite's worked with mainly married, middle-aged people who had enough high school to get some kind of qualification as a teacher or a teacher's aide. We were at Lamakaza in ancient Beaumont missile base, where there was the idea of setting up something called Manitou College for Aboriginal. It eventually failed. But that summer, I met a couple of Naskapi from Shefferville in northern Quebec. What they discovered was the negotiations for the James Bay Agreement began in November 1974, this is midsummer 1975, so the negotiations had been going on, and only then they discovered that while the James Bay court case had only concerned the building of the area covered by the hydroelectric dams, both Inuit and the Cree had been involved in the court case, and therefore both the Inuit and the Cree got to be negotiators for a settlement out of court, essentially what the James Bay Agreement was to be. But nobody had bothered to say that the government decided to change the terms of the surrender of land from the area covered by the James Bay Project to the whole of northern Quebec, right up to the border with Labrador, or including the whole of that. That included all of the traditional territory of the Naskapi. The Naskapi had never been even informed, had not participated in the court case. And it absolutely outraged me that first of all, these kids had come to, the only two kids who had any kind of high school were sent down by their chief to Montreal to try and get their land that was about to be extinguished under the James Bay Agreement, get some kind of a settlement. They had previously lived in much further north. They had traded at Fort Chimo, as it was then, and so they knew some of the Inuit. And the Inuit had made promises to them that they would get them, because if you remember, by this point, under the agreement in principle, the land allotment for the Inuit was to be twice as generous as the land allotment. The Category 1, Category 2 lands were being twice as large, on the argument, superficially the argument was that the North is less rich in resources. You need more land for hunting and for that. The real reason was that while the Cree insisted on maintaining federal status under the Indian Act and maintaining that link, the Inuit were quite willing to become ordinary Quebec citizens with ordinary voting. And so the whole regime in the Inuit, in Nunavik, was totally different from the Cree. The Inuit, the Naskapi were were assured by the Inuit that they would get the Inuit deal. And so now but like the Cree, the Inuit, the Naskapi also wanted to maintain the federal connection. That's all they had known in terms of administration up to then. So anyway, I was very lucky. I wrote to communicated to my department, and they gave me the semester off when I should have been teaching. I stayed in Montreal and became the chief negotiator, and we put together a team, found a lawyer, got a negotiating team together. However, nobody, and this was during the negotiations were an extraordinary undertaking. They'd set themselves a 12-month deadline, and certainly by the time I became involved, meetings were happening at 3 in the morning, at around the clock, meetings on different tables, the different parts of the negotiation and that. And it was make or break time. There were things that the Inuit had wanted to get on the table, and better environmental protection and these sorts of things that were being taken off the table. And it was basically a really good agreement. But in the last few weeks, there was a lot of heavy dealing in that, and the Naskapi were left out. We were given sort of basic assurances by both the Cree and the Inuit that we would be allowed in at a later date, and that's what happened. I I hired, my replacement was Paul Wilkinson, who became the negotiator. You know, there was nobody of Inuit, of Naskapi descent who could possibly be a negotiator. They really, I mean, the chief was an amazingly smart man, Joe Garnish. He could write as fast as you could talk in syllabics. There was one of these syllabic places, but he spoke not a word of English, and you know, it was a so. So I think they were lucky to get after the fact get involved in the James Bay negotiations. Meanwhile, back in Newfoundland, I was increasingly aware of the unfair situation of Aboriginal people in that province, and so we started something called the Native People Support Group. This was a non-academic, it was, you know, a populist movement, and it wasn't particularly, there weren't very many Native people living in St. John's. It was a St. John's organization, mainly of non-Native supporters who agreed. And so we gave opportunities for the Aboriginal groups when they came to St. John's to talk to the government. We set up press, press, gatherings and prepared background documents for press, and tried to make the arguments that under the situation at the time, funds designated for education, health, and community infrastructure were administered by a branch of the Newfoundland government, more or less as a form of welfare. And it simply was a very bad, there was constant, and so, you know, we engaged in things like public disobedience. We supported the Micmac when they occupied an office of the government and did various things in the background like that. Meanwhile, I'm doing this land use and occupancy study of the Innu of southern part of Labrador. Again, one of the objectionable things about land claims is it's province by province. As you know, Canada was set up on the basis that Indians and land set aside for Indians are exclusively federal. And so in theory, the Innu Nation, which includes most of whom live in Quebec, should be a single claim for all of the Innu of both Quebec and Labrador. But the federal government has allowed the province to set the terms of negotiation. So I worked simply on the, although I documented the use of Western Labrador by people who are nowadays centered either in Schefferville or in Sept-Îles, Maniotenam, Mangan, all of those North Shore communities, most of their hunting grounds were across the border in Quebec, but the boundary was being acknowledged in land claims. So it's very unfair, and it still continues. Yeah, I was quite busy, and then lo and behold, by 1997, the deadline for my thesis is up. You know, I wrote a couple of papers on the thesis, the one I told you about on the analysis of the hunting territories and their change over time. I'd written something on scapulomancy, questioning the current theories at the time on the explanations of scapulomancy, this form of divination of the future. But I remember I basically sat down for a month in my house in Newfoundland and wrote the thing, and sent it off, and it was, and then defended it at Toronto. Eric Schwimmer and I had been working on it over the years. That was another thing that happened during those years from sort of 72 to 77. I would be taking trips either to Toronto, where Eric was, or to McGill. He shifted to Laval, and I'd used to come a couple of times to Quebec City, and he's such a genius. I mean, that man, I can never approach his level of expertise or abilities on that, but he was a marvelous supervisor and great inspiration to me. So I got the thing finished, and it was passed, and again, I was so busy with other things, I didn't really make much changes before Eric found a publisher he was dealing with on another project, a publisher in England, a small, very small academic publisher. Such things still existed in those days. And so I took a trip to London and met the one-man, it was a kind of a one-man operation. He took me to his club on the Strand. It was a very sort of colonial sort of situation, but they published the book more or less with very little text editing. And I'm not particularly proud of that edition of the book because the photographs were very sketchy, and I hadn't really done enough work changing it from a thesis to a book. Anyway, it was great to get a publication at such a out of a book rather than a few articles. So I continued that, but by 79, I'm starting to look for other fieldwork opportunities, something completely different, something different from the North. Through an invitation, I spent a couple of months in Israel. Actually, Jean Briggs, who was had a professorship at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I met several of her colleagues. But again, I was horrified by the treatment of the Arabs, and even then, I could not get a conversation going with anthropologists there about how this was just like colonialism and just like the treatment of Aboriginal people in North America had been, and nobody seemed to understand this, So I've followed events in Israel since, not professionally, but interested. I also had a Bangladeshi student who wrote his master's thesis under me, me knowing nothing about Bangladesh or anything, but it was on the caste system in India and its application in Muslim Bangladesh, or the lack of it. And it was a very interesting thesis on that. But anyway, he went back home and I got an invitation to visit. So Marguerite and I took a extended vacation. We spent time in Nepal and in Bangladesh. I went to the Chittagong Hills, which Levi-Strauss had written about, and saw the horrendous situation where Buddhists were fleeing from oppression across the border in Malaysia and were being systematically discriminated against by the mainly Muslim. The Chittagong Hills were being developed for hydroelectric, including by Canadian and Scandinavian companies were there. But it became clear to me, the brother of my former student, even himself could not, and he had a university position in Bangladesh, couldn't get permission to do research in the Chittagong Hills. So, I had been looking for places to do research. 1980, I had a sabbatical, and friend of mine from the UBC days I'd kept up with, Ross Clark, was a linguist, then centered in Auckland in New Zealand and doing research in Vanuatu. So I thought, oh, Vanuatu, that's it. Eric asked me if I wouldn't mind visiting his people in the Archiva, and so I planned a trip where I would, but also he and Akiung and I organized this proposal to do a reconnaissance trip to the Mentawai Islands to do. She was already doing research in Bukatingi up in the hills where women are very active as traders, and they're the kind of front of the household. The men are much more in the background, and that. Anyway, she was doing that interesting research, and I visited her. But with her help, I'd also got a agreement with Andalas University in Sumatra, in West Sumatra. They supplied me with an assistant who would accompany me, and I didn't speak any Indonesian. He didn't speak any Mentawai, but there were enough people who spoke Indonesian. However, it was all because I had been waiting and waiting. I'd spent time with Ross Clark and watched the celebrations in 1980 for independence, where this French-British condominium, a colony with both two they watched that country get its independence. It was quite dramatic because there was rebel stuff going on in the background, and it was very interesting. And while I was there, I visited a small island called Epi, and I walked all the way around the island in 2 days. It was a copra plantation, coconut, and copra had been the basis for making soaps in Europe, and so it was a big industry. And by the time detergents came out after the Second War, it sort of knocked the bottom out of the copra market. And so all of this island of Epi that I visited, there had been French colons there. And they had had a marvelous life. I visited this large house where, by reputation, the servants stood behind each diner in the dining room. They had brought in exotic Arab stallion racing horses, and they held races with these. And these were simply running wild in the forest when I was there. They'd all left all this stuff. And the new independent government had announced that it would return what it called custom land to its custom owners. And this looked how do we determine who and has there, been about 2 generations since they'd been excluded from their land or allowed to remain as workers on these copra plantations. But so it looked very interesting. So that was 1980. I went home. I continued my trip around the world. Went to the Solomon Islands for a week or 2, and then I went to Port Moresby in Indonesia, thinking I would go and visit the Archiva, but nothing more. But the Indonesian government kept delaying. They had an office in Port Moresby, and I'd hang out there, but there was no word on when they would give me permission to do this, come and do this research. So to save money, I hung out at the university and made friends with some young men who were, and young ladies who were planning to be civil servants or lawyers or doctors and that, you know, the regular university crowd hung out with. And then the university shut down for the Pacific Arts Festival, or in preparation for the, and all of these guys were going to go home. And they said, "Do you want to?" And I was staying in one of the rooms with them. You know, there was a spare bed. They didn't. Some guy had gone home early, and that. So I had a cheap place to live, and I hung out with them. They said, "Come home to." So we flew to Mount Hagen, and then took a bus. Took a pickup truck. To their village in the Western Highlands. So there's a highway going straight through. I got suspicious when in the middle of the night we were stopped, and the driver refused to go any further. And he said, tribal warfare has broken out between you guys people, and they'll just attack anybody on the road, particularly if they think you've got members of your tribe there. So he refused. So we walked through the night and got there in the middle of the morning. Next day, sure enough, there's the old women, old men sit up on the. It's almost like watching a soccer match. The enemy come in and throwing spears and had bows and arrows and axes and that, and then everybody picks up the arrows and that. And when they run out, then it goes the other direction. Everybody's shooting arrows and throwing spears. And at the worst, you know, people might get a bloody foot. You know, people, young men would come back, you know, and they're all dressed in traditional grass skirts. And these young men in white shirts and that were suddenly become native. They were the warriors, and they were despite the fact that they were university, they were nothing. They were just young kids, and they were to go off to war. And it seemed relatively harmless until the man I was living with was killed. What happened? Tribal fighting at that time, and still is illegal. And the way the police try to deal with it, they'll drive in these four-wheel drives along the highway, but they don't dare get too far off into the bush. So they bring in helicopters, and they drop tear gas onto the fighters to disperse them and to stop the tribal fighting. And what happened was, in this case, the tear gas had forced my friend, who had just gone there to watch the fight, he hadn't even been engaged in the fighting, he went the wrong way, ran into a bunch of the enemy, they hacked him to pieces and threw his body in the river.